Good afternoon. My name is Jamie Welch, and this is my data analysis report. The data that I'm going to be reporting and analyzing to you all this afternoon is data on an Algebra and Concepts and Connections course. This data comes from one teacher's courses. This is actually two classes combined, but it's one teacher and her results. The data is going to be the Algebra Concepts and Connections end of course test. We're also going to look at those same students' previous year's milestones results from the 8th grade end of grade assessment and their benchmark test, which is a benchmark that is used in this system. It's the IXL platform, and they use the diagnostic platform within IXL. And so we're going to look at patterns and relationships between all of these test scores and see really and truly how we can improve student achievement on the Algebra EOC test for the next year. So that's our goal, is to use the findings to implement a plan for that, to increase the student achievement for the next year. Now, this analysis also is trying to determine the validity of the IXL diagnostic test and if it's really a true indicator of EOC performance, because we are kind of questioning whether our students are trying their best on the IXLs, or if it's really if it's really a valid measure of student achievement. So we're first going to look at the IXL data. You can see we're looking at benchmark 1 and benchmark 2. So benchmark 1 is taken at the beginning of the course, and the average score on benchmark 1 was 594, which means about a 6th grade level. It's 5th grade, 94, a little bit further along in 5th grade. So you can see that the average did increase at the end of the year to 690. So the average went up about a grade level. So still not really where you'd like for 9th grade students to be at the end of a course, but at least we did see some pretty good growth here. I'm seeing our benchmark number 2 data almost could look a little skewed if we really wanted to be nice about it, toward to where we're seeing higher scores on that right end, whereas benchmark number 1 looks a little more a little lower there. We do notice the standard deviations a little bit higher in benchmark number 2. I believe that's from one student scoring about an 11th grade level. So that really increased that the differences from the mean there. Okay, so what we tend to do in the system is we actually look at the benchmark growth. So we want to know, how much did students tend to grow from the beginning of the course to the end of the course. And so the average growth was 95 points, which is about 100 points, which is about a full grade level. So the strengths that we see in this data is that 29 students improved by at least one grade level. And this is a histogram here of, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that in the last slide, that we're looking at histograms. So that's not necessarily, the amount of students that scored one specific score. It's the amount of students that scored within that range. And I chose to create a range of 100 for each little bin or bar, because that gives you how many students were in that grade level. So if you look at the 700 to 800 bar, you can kind of see that about maybe 13 students were in that grade level. So that gives you an idea of just really their grade level, not their specific score. So same thing with this benchmark growth. I really wanted to look at did they grow 1 or 2 grade levels? Did they grow 2 or 3 grade levels? And so you can see about 10 students grew between 2 and 3 grade levels. 2 and 300 points would be 2 and 3 grade levels. So we did have to have 29 students improving by at least one grade level is significant benchmark growth. We did have 6 students that actually regressed, so that's showing some weakness there. That may be due to many things, absences, students maybe not trying their best, things like that. Now, let's take a look at how this relates to the milestones data. So next we're looking at the 8th grade EOG achievement levels versus the Algebra 1 EOG achievement levels. And so, or EOC, achievement levels. And so what that is our, we looked at 8th graders and, the same group, but what they scored in 8th grade. And we looked at them in those achievement level descriptors, so distinguished, proficient, developing, or beginning. And you can see that we actually had, a higher developing band or bar there in the 8th grade EOG achievement levels than we did in the Algebra 1. So, oh, yay, maybe they moved to proficient. Well, it doesn't look like that because now our beginning levels increase there. So we saw a pretty big weakness here to me, that we had 13 students that actually went down an achievement level from their EOC scores, from their EOG scores to those EOC scores in the 9th grade. So we had 6 that actually moved from developing to beginning, 6 that moved from proficient to developing, and 1 that actually moved from distinguished to proficient. We did have 9 that actually went up a level, so it was kind of, odd to see that. 2 moved to developing. We had a lot that actually moved from beginning to proficient, but just not enough to offset the 13 that went down a level. Okay, so what was interesting to me then was to look at if our IXL data, our diagnostic test, showed so much growth, why then did our milestones growth not show that? So our IXL data, remember, was it's right there on the slide, an average growth of 95 points, and the average growth for our milestones was negative 5 points. So, not really a correlation there. So we actually did calculate the correlation coefficient for IXL growth to the milestones growth, and the correlation coefficient was positive, meaning that as one growth measure increased, the other growth measure increased as well, but it was not it was not significant enough. The correlation coefficient was not close enough to a positive 1 for me to really invest in those the IXL data and the IXL growth, really helping me predict EOC growth for this coming year. So as I'm looking at my milestones growth, I want you guys to understand how I created this chart. This is actually a bar chart, not a histogram. So each bar actually does represent a student's growth. So if you see a really tall bar, that's one student that had really high growth. If you see a bar going down very low in the negative direction, that's one student who regressed a lot. And so you can see that on the left side of this bar chart, you see most of your growth. And so what I did is I took my students' data and I put it in order from highest achieving to lowest achieving on their EOC. So our higher achieving students actually had higher growth. And then my lower achieving students actually had lower growth, or the lower achieving students in this data actually they regressed. So it seems like they're the ones who are really it's not being met for them. So the next question is, since we know that our IXL growth did not really help us determine our milestones growth, is can the EOG scores help us determine where our EOC scores can be for the next year? And so I actually took the EOG scores and EOC scores and calculated the correlation coefficient for those and created a scatter plot that you can see. And so you can see that lower EOG scores typically produce lower EOC scores, and so on. The correlation coefficient was 0.75, which told me that there was a significant positive correlation between the two. So I can tell that if I had a student with a higher EOG score, they're probably going to have a higher EOC score as well. The p-value was practically 0, so that suggests that there is sufficient evidence that the EOG scores can be used to predict them. So with that being said, that led me to my SMART plan. What what can I use to increase student achievement for the coming school year? And so I decided that we would use the previous year's milestones data. So we're going to start the year with a vertical alignment meeting where administration will facilitate this meeting with the template that is shown on your screen. Teachers will use the state LDS platform to group students within that template. So if I'm teaching 7th grade, I'll look at my students that year and look at their 6th grade EOG scores and put them in those appropriate quadrants. And then I'll write their name, and then I'll also put their score in parentheses, and then circle any students, or maybe highlight whatever the teacher would like to do, any students that are right on the verge of moving up a achievement level, or maybe even falling down, so that they can kind of be on my radar. So then I will take that data and identify a plan for differentiation for any of those students. I'm going to call them our bubble students. And so I'm going to actually take those students and dive deeper into their data and look at what units, or not units, but what domains were they struggling with? Where did they need to see, where were they quite not yet on their EOG assessment data from the previous year? I will take that data and use it to create a plan for differentiation throughout my unit plans and my pacing guide. So that's kind of something that can be ongoing throughout the year for teachers to do. What we really want to see at the beginning of the year is that teachers just first off identify who those students are and create this just one sheet where they can identify these students and really look into their data and go into the year knowing which students are right on that verge of moving up or down. Next, they're going to go and look at the whole group data. What are the weaknesses and the strengths from the previous state testing? So you may see that this whole classroom, this whole group, 70% of them were beginning learners in fractions, or beginning learners in functions and their relationships. And so teachers need to use that whole group data to create that course pacing guide. And that's what we want to see, those two things done at the beginning of the year. One, that they use that milestone data to go ahead and identify what students need to be targeted for differentiation throughout the year. And then two, using that milestones data to actually create their pacing guide for the year. And so those are the two big things that are going to happen at the beginning of the year. And then to support teachers throughout the year, administration is going to facilitate monthly data meetings. And so teachers are going to be bringing their assessment data each month. Maybe this would be unit assessments. Maybe it would be a formative assessment. Whatever the teachers feel like they really need some help looking at and analyzing that month or during that meeting time. Sharing strengths and weaknesses within that data with each other. And this will kind of be led by department. The department heads or administration can collect and document those meetings to make sure this is happening. Teachers will turn in their pacing guides at the beginning of the year and continuously bring assessment data. Another thing that we're looking for teachers to do to make sure that this is like continuously happening throughout the year is when they have a big unit test, take that same template that we saw in the previous slide. So I'll go back to that. And instead of it saying distinguished, we'll change that to A's, 90s to 100. Instead of proficient, we'll change that to B's in the 80s, or developing 70s. In the beginning would be your failures. And see how each of your unit assessments is aligning, and those students are aligning or growing with their EOG data. Hopefully you're seeing some students that started out at the beginning of the year, when you looked at your EOG data, they were in a quadrant that was lower to the right, and they're moving along throughout the year. And if teachers are doing this consistently with each unit, they're going to be more mindful of differentiating for those students and remediating or accelerating learning for students that need it. So a summary of what we have found. Overall, we need to improve student achievement on algebra concepts and connections EOC test. That's no question there. We need to improve that achievement as shown on that test. And the EOG scores can be used to predict the EOC scores. So EOG scores are a good predictor of how our students are going to do on that EOC. Growth in IXL does not mean growth in our state testing, so we can use that. It can, help us determine their grade level, maybe provide some great vertical alignment, conversations. However, if we're really wanting to improve those EOC scores, we need to be looking at previous EOG scores. So what we're going to do is use the EOG scores to plan for the upcoming year and intentionally plan for differentiation for students based on those EOG scores. We're going to be designing pacing guides that are based on student achievement, not just on the curriculum that's given or on how long a teacher thinks that teaching fractions should take. We're going to provide support for teachers throughout the year using these monthly data meetings facilitated by administrators and where teachers can come together and talk things through. Thank you for listening.